And welcome back, everybody. Hands-on apologetics. And I was looking forward to this segment, as I always do, talking about the Sabbath and the interesting background of the Sabbath and its development in theology over the years. And of course, there's a couple that's been doing groundbreaking research and has a credible series on their YouTube channel. Of course, I'm talking about Arthur and Teresa Beam, our good friends. They're both converts from Seventh-day Adventism, and the YouTube channel is called Arthur and Teresa Beam, Beem, and the author of several fantastic books on Seventh-day Adventism. And Arthur and Teresa, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Gary. Good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us back.
Yeah, absolutely. So how have you been? I know it's been pretty hectic in your neck of the woods.
Yeah.
Granddaughters.
And we were in an auto accident that took us out for about 8 months, and we're okay, but it was just only bumps and bruises. But when you get to be our age, those bumps and bruises just don't. It just takes a while.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, especially when you have granddaughters.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
And you get other bumps and bruises, you know?
Yeah, I have a pair of granddaughters who are living with us right now. So they're a joy, but they take a lot of energy.
Yeah, they do.
That's right.
Yeah.
They're great,
So,
aren't they?
yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's certainly a blessing. And talk about blessing. I've been following your series on YouTube on the story of the Sabbath. And man, you guys have done some great research. I'm so glad you put that series up. I know you also put a lot of work into it as well. I mean, it looks great.
Years and years. We've been working on it for 2 years, but that was the technical, getting it on video. But we've been working on just the actual research for it for about 20 years. But I have a question for you.
Okay.
You can read German, right? Because I've been listening to your YouTube videos on your Armageddon.
Yeah.
It's not Armageddon, but anyway, I've actually been listening to him, and when you research, finding things, I mean, a lot of the church history is not in English. It has not been translated into English, but it has been treated into, the Germans want to translate all the Latin so that they can read it. And so that's been my biggest frustration is doing all this research, is that there's just not a lot available for people, English speakers, who can't read Latin. That's got to be my next thing.
Learning Latin. Yeah, well, that wasn't me. It's probably William Albrecht, who speaks fluent German and Spanish as well. So if I came up with something from German, I probably ran it through William.
Oh, okay.
That would be a good resource for you if you need stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you've done a lot of research on the Apocrypha, and I mean, that's so fascinating. You do a great job. I listen to them a lot. So anyway.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, at least if you have insomnia, that's that will help you out quite a bit. So
it's good. I've enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the plug too. So let's set up the Sabbath. Of course, Seventh-day Adventism. I mean, that's the cornerstone of Seventh-day Adventism is the Sabbath. As a Catholic, I mean, it's. I think most Catholics wouldn't have the clue what to say about the Sabbath, really.
Right.
I mean, there's a lot of ignorance. So why don't you take us on a worldwide tour of what you've been doing in your videos?
Well, I guess the question then would be, what is the story of the Sabbath? Really, what we're looking at is we set it up in segments to start early, all the way back, and Sabbath at creation, Sabbath among the Israelites, Sabbath, lunar Sabbaths.
Well, this is on our YouTube channel.
Yeah,
by the way.
yeah, it is on. Each segment is on there. Synagogue versus temple.
And how that relates to the Sabbath.
Right. And Jesus, during Jesus' specific time on earth. early church father writings on the Sabbath.
This is where the Catholics might be interested, is when we start talking about the ecclesiastical history and the theological development.
Right, through Catholic history, right. And then Reformation in the 17th century Sabbath wars.
Most people don't really, because Catholics kind of had the Sabbath thing figured out in the first century.
Right.
But Protestants, that was very, very interesting. In the 17th century, just at the explosion of Protestantism, the Sabbath became a massive topic, so massive that there was more things that were published about the Sabbath than any other topic during the Sabbath Wars, which was about 50 years of the Reformation, and in English anyway.
And it kind of feels like the whole story was lost for a while. Mm-hmm. The story of the Sabbath.
So we're bringing it back.
So we're bringing it back.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah. So the Sabbath wars, I imagine it's probably because Protestants felt that the Sunday worship was something that was instituted by the church. Am I right? Or is it they're just going by the Bible alone? Or
all of a sudden you have all these people, sola scriptura, me and the Bible and God. Mm-hmm. We don't need anybody playing interference for our interpretation. And so now all these people started reading scripture, and they wanted to know, wait a minute, what is this about Sabbath? Are we supposed to be keeping the Sabbath from the fourth commandment? Is it supposed to be is it supposed to be on Saturday, the seventh day? Has the seventh day always been the seventh day? In other words, has it always been Saturday? And then a lot of times they would do a little research, and they ran into this idea of the early Israelites keeping a lunar Sabbath. So now what does that mean, and how does that affect Sabbath keeping? And when do we keep it? From Friday night, Saturday, from Friday night sundown to Saturday night sundown? I mean, every possible thing you can imagine about how to keep the seventh day as a rest. Do we worship on it? You know, the Israelites had a mandated worship once they entered the promised land on this, but they had worship every day. I mean, in other words, it was really more of they called it a sacred assembly. What was a sacred assembly? Do we have to keep Leviticus 23? You know what I'm saying? So all these people were reading about the Sabbath in the Bible, and nobody knew what to do. And it then turned into, well, did the Catholics change the Sabbath to Sunday? What does that mean? And you get so many books written at that time by, I would say, wannabe scholars. You know, everybody is a scholar once they start reading the Bible and they think they understand it, which I'm not saying that they can't. I'm just saying everybody's now, their interpretation, they believe, is they're going to go out and fight. And so this is what happened during the Sabbath Wars. And it's really a fascinating story how the idea of the seventh-day Sabbath even came into America. There are Masonic influences and Jewish influences.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. So we've got, just follow the story throughout, and the last one we did, we don't try to completely solve it. We just want to show Adventists that it is not what they think it is. Adventists believe that during the reign of Constantine changed the Sabbath to Sunday, and that it was by the pushing of the Pope and the bishops, the Catholic bishops, because they wanted to actually worship the devil or the god of the sun. See, this is how twisted it became. Yeah. So we're trying to explain how the Catholic Church went from worshiping on Sunday as the Lord's Day all the way through to the last one we did was on John Paul II's Days Domini, and how the most recent catechism, and it is kind of an interesting story because it isn't exactly perfectly as you would think it would be. So
right.
Yeah. One last question, then I'll let you dive into the particulars is, So the Sabbath Wars, does this come up to the time of Ellen Gold White and Seventh-day Adventist, or did it die down and then Seventh-day Adventism start?
Well, and nothing is ever this perfect. It's from this year to this year.
Right.
It kind of in the I would say even the late 1600s, or late 1500s, it started, and there was a few writers, a few Protestant writers, early Protestant writers, that started focusing in on it, and it turned into a full-fledged war about the mid 17th century. But it went on through. There was still a trickle on of interest in it, even up to Ellen White's time and through Ellen White's day. So, yeah. So, yes, the answer is, it influenced, definitely influenced. A lot of Adventists went back to these Protestant writers and their Protestant view of what happened in Christian history, and they clung to that.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Yeah, it seems like Constantine's always a lightning rod for any theory out there that you could hang it on Constantine that he did it.
That's right. That's right. Well, and it's because once you've got one reformer using him, then all of a sudden, everybody, maybe he's the bad guy.
He seems to sanction it for all the other reformers that,
Yeah. Well, I think really to understand, we probably need a context of how Adventists, because there's words in Adventism that do not mean the same thing as in, they use the same exact word or phrase, but it doesn't mean the same thing.
Like when we first started coming on your show, we had 2 or 3 shows that were just about vocabulary.
Right.
How it's so important to understand that the words are used, like she just said, they're not the same meaning, but even the person saying the word uses it as the same meaning. It becomes very confusing.
Yeah, and just like right now, in the last, I would say 10 years, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has adopted the idea of sola scriptura from the reformers. They're trying to come across more mainstream, but they've changed the definition within Adventism, because every single thing that Adventists believe, not every single thing, but most of things that make them unique, come from Ellen White's quote, visions from God, straight from an angel of God. And so they just
through the lens,
they put that in. So when they go to the Bible, they say, we're just using scripture.
Well, like for instance, to clear up some Adventist misunderstandings about Catholics' view on, say, Sunday obligation, we don't have necessarily a day of worship. To them, they have one correct day of worship, and it's not just that it's one correct day of worship. It's one correct day of worship, and all the others are bad.
Oh, well, I mean, the Bible says the commandments, it's a fourth commandment to Protestants, most Protestants anyway, and to Adventists, it's the fourth commandment that says, in 6 days shall you labor. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the 7th is the Sabbath. That's the day that they keep. So they must labor. They can't worship or rest on 6 days.
Right. Therefore, that terminology, to them, it's evil to go to public or corporate worship on any other day. So it really, covers obviously Catholics, but especially even most Protestants even would come under that heading. So especially Sunday, because it's this supposed pagan corporate, it's a pagan worship day of the sun to them. And so that gets very conflated and they get very stuck in that, if you can talk to them about it. But they're usually very, because of their vocabulary, it's difficult to get through to them to accept that because of Constantine and everything else. So late 1800s, Adventists they actually lobbied politicians and lawyers to be able to work on Sunday, to fulfill that 6 day, so you should labor. So that day of worship is difficult with them.
Because they would think you can't just worship any day of the week. You can only worship one day a week.
That's it.
And that has to be the seventh day. So whenever Adventist hears we have one, when they talk about a day of worship, they're not understanding that you can worship any day. The Catholics have Mass every single day. To them, that's what goes into their brain is you only worship one day a week. They don't understand. Adventists don't even realize Catholics have Mass every day.
And if you were to say that to them, a lot of them, maybe not all of them, but would say, yes, but you go to church on Sunday as well, which really gives you an insight into their thought process of they look at Sunday as a counterfeit. As a counterfeit.
If you really love the Lord, you're going to obey the commandment and only rest and worship one day a week, and it has to be the seventh.
Right.
And even their prophecies, they have Ellen White is their prophet, and she predicted that in the last days, the absolute defining last. Why don't you just read that? Arthur's got he's got a quote from
it's very short, but it tells you very much how they think. Okay,
can you read that?
Yeah, I can read it. So this is from the Seventh-day Adventist Church official site,
right?
And this is a quote from Ellen G. White. It says, the Seventh-day Adventist understanding of the three angels' messages, including the centrality of the gospel in its end-time proclamation, the Sabbath is a final expression of loyalty to the Creator. Satan's counterfeit worship and enforcement of Sunday worship are all consistent with Bible teaching and Ellen G. White's writings.
So they believe that the Sabbath is the final expression of loyalty to the Creator.
Yeah.
So their entire their gospel has Sabbath keeping intertwined for it because they believe that this is going to be a last day test. And so we are trying to explain to them how that's their view. But Catholics have we're based on the same words, but just different meanings. We have a different worldview that they've got to understand because we're not going to come after them because they believe that Catholics are going to come out after Seventh-day Adventists in the last days and slaughter them because they're going to keep the Seventh-day Sabbath.
Right.
So we don't really too much fight against that in this particular series. We on our website, we have many different series, but this particular one is called The Story of the Sabbath, and it just takes them through the Catholic view of the story of the Sabbath. So they can, rather than debate them, they can just see the story of the Sabbath through Catholic eyes. And one of the things we discovered is that the early church fathers said that Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath, that Christians didn't need to keep a Sabbath. And this is almost there are many church fathers and not just church fathers, but I don't know, do you consider Justin Martyr and Tertullian a church father? So, I mean, even we're not talking just bishops. We're talking about a lot of the early writers. None of them took this idea that Sunday was a Christian Sabbath. All of them ubiquitously said that Christ fulfilled the Sabbath and we no longer have to keep it. Now, a smaller section of that, even of those people, a few of them went even further and said that Jesus became our Sabbath in the same way that he became the temple and the sacrificial lamb and all this. So they were already, even though that's not in scripture, they were already taking the idea of this beautiful concept of the Sabbath and adding on to it, just like they did the Trinity and all the other concepts. But they saw Christ, and Augustine and Chrysostom wrote more about the Sabbath, I think, than all the others. But if you really want to get a profound view of the Sabbath, go back and study it from St. Augustine. He wrote some just beautiful things about it.
Yeah, it's very good. So the early church, they basically said that Christ fulfills the Sabbath, and therefore that it wasn't a special day, the Sabbath. Is that correct?
Well, they would. Well, it's interesting because so the earliest church weren't able to text each other and tell them what the development was like. So the eastern side actually kept keeping the Sabbath rest on Saturday, whereas the West more jettisoned it. I mean, they held Mass every single day that they could. They would meet before the sun came up, and a lot of times they would have Mass daily. But there was a section of Christianity in the East, and it wasn't ubiquitous, but it was some of them actually continued to keep the Sabbath rest. But when you were a slave, you couldn't really control that. And so I think that's one of the reasons the Lord allowed people just to, let those Sabbath days and days of obligation go at that time, because the church couldn't fight for them. They would not be able to get off to keep a Sabbath rest on any day of the week. And so I do think that's one of the reasons that it wasn't played up, is because by Christians at the time, is because it would have been very, very difficult for them to insist on resting on a Sabbath day when many of them couldn't have controlled it anyway. And they would have just been, they would have had an obligation that they would constantly have to go and confess because they didn't have any. And some of the early church fathers believed that the final Sabbath was fulfilled when Christ rested in the tomb, that was actually the last Sabbath. So, but I do want to insert this because this is so neat. So we have about 800 years that it was just, there wasn't any one way of thinking about the Sabbath. They believed it was Judaizing to push people into saying they had to keep a Sabbath day. But Saturday, during I wouldn't say the high Middle Ages, I would say, the Middle Ages, 1100, 1100-ish, it started to be a day where they honored Mary, because during that day that Christ was in the tomb, who did the apostles go to just kind of keep him strong? It was Mary. And so Saturday was dedicated to her. And you will see a little tidbit of that here and there during the Middle Ages. It's not, you don't see a lot of the stuff that we have available to us in English doesn't play up that a lot. But I thought it was still a really sweet thing that they would honor Mary during Mass every seventh day of the week. So. Yeah,
that is cool. So coming into the Middle Ages, was there much more development? Like you said, there was like the first 800 years. It was there was diversity, but generally it was understood Jesus fulfills the Sabbath, and then you have that further development with Mary. Any other changes?
Oh yeah,
moving into modern.
And I'm going to throw this out. You can correct me. You probably know more about this than I do, but from what we read, Thomas Aquinas wasn't especially well known in his day. He was actually, now this is what the Protestants claim, so I don't know if this is true, but that the Protestants revived a lot of Thomas Aquinas writings. Now, would that jive with what you've known?
Yeah, I don't know if that would be true.
Okay. Well, and that's why I want to throw it out, because that was a Protestant scholar's view. But Thomas Aquinas was one of the very first prominent Catholic theologians that brought in the idea of paralleling Sunday with the Jewish Sabbath. And up until then, a lot of people were keeping it that way. But the church had not really recognized it that way. There was a lot of scholastic debate on whether the Lord's Day was a Sabbath or not, but they hadn't made any declaration. So you can go back and find all kinds of quotes from different historians that say, okay, well, we see the parallels in the Lord's Day and the Sabbath, and there were some beautiful writings on both sides, but the church didn't make an actual affirmation either way. The popes even disagreed with it, with the different sides. So it was actually Thomas Aquinas who set the stage for the church entering into a time frame where they started giving Sabbath qualities to Sunday. And so you have bishops in some area that were saying you must rest on Sunday, but then some areas that they didn't. And it really was, people don't realize, but as far as Sunday obligation, where the entire church was no longer you were to rest and have the Sunday obligation, was in the 1917 Code of Canon Law. And while you can find a lot of areas that did do that already before that, that was the first time there was ubiquitous. Now, ubiquitous law for the entire church. Now, you do have St. Bellarmine's Catechism of the Council of Trent that also gives a lot of Sabbatarian views to Sunday. But again, that it wasn't a pronouncement from the church, because, the Catechism of the Council of Trent wasn't directly, they didn't talk about it in the Council of Trent at all. The Sabbath wasn't even brought up at any point. But when they did the catechism, they had to deal with that. And so you're going to get from then on, like the Baltimore Catechism is going to be a little more specific. But when you come to the JP2's, the great, JP2's catechism, it leaves it kind of open. It doesn't necessarily say that Sunday is a Sabbath, but it's not quite as clear as the Baltimore Catechism in giving Sabbath characteristics to Sunday. And so even today, you can hear a lot of Catholic apologists and priests and bishops. Arthur and I went to the bishops' conference a few years ago in Baltimore, right? And we talked to a whole bunch of bishops just to ask them, do you consider Sunday a Sabbath? And of the ones that actually answered, I mean, most of them are really busy, and they, and I didn't mean to bother them, but they were on their way. But of the ones that had the time to answer, we got a bunch of different answers. They were not unified in what they believed that Sunday was a Sabbath. And I thought that was interesting. And so anyway.
Yeah, and I think what happens is that the definition, when you ask young Adventists, and this is why it's important to Catholics, this is why it's important for Catholics to know this as well, is that it goes back to what you said about their vocabulary. The vocabulary on this topic is not the same. And what you find now are young Adventists that are essentially believing whatever they feel comfortable to believe. They don't they have, their 28 fundamental beliefs. They're more like suggestions to them. It's their catechism, and they have different views on what the church documents say and mean. And so it's important to be able to talk to them, to get through to them, to understand how they're speaking about Sabbath. It's not the same. It's difficult. You need to.
Yeah, it is very, very difficult to get on the same page because of the Catholics I've spoken to about this, they feel very strongly. This is a topic which is interesting, is they don't know the history of the Catholic Church, and they can get very, very passionate about their belief. But no matter what their passion is, it's not going to equal talking to an Adventist about until you can get on the same page as what these words mean. Because remember, Adventists believe there's only one day of worship. a week. Every other day, it is of the devil to worship. That's what's going to be the last days. So you can't go into an Adventist and say, well, we keep one day a week. It's just not going to translate the same.
Yeah, especially when it's a salvation issue, right? Like you said, it's that's what you're going to be judged on, is whether or not you honor the Creator by worshiping on that particular day.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So I don't know if any Adventists are going to, well, I know that not a lot of Adventists have watched the Story of the Sabbath episodes yet, but we kind of wanted to finish it completely. We've got one more, we've got a conclusion, either 1 or 2 episodes to do, and then we'll start actually promoting it, because I wanted to make sure we could get through the whole entire series before I started promoting it. But it's something we've been working on for 2 years. So it's interesting. And we would like to eventually do a book for Catholics about the Sabbath, but from a Catholic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be fantastic, because I know there's nothing out there, certainly not book length. There might be a chapter here and there, or, an appendix or something, but never full length treatment, at least to my mind. So that would be huge if you could do that.
I would love to. And the early church fathers present a Sabbath that is so gorgeous that has been lost. And it needs to be rediscovered, because St. Augustine and St. Chrysostom, Chrysostom, am I saying that right?
Chrysostom, yeah, you got it right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
They really write some beautiful, beautiful stuff about the Sabbath.
Yeah, so if it is such, there's so much weight on this one point from their perspective. The question is, well, how can you get around that to, for them to think open-mindedly about the meaning of the Sabbath? Do you think that beauty of the early church fathers is enough to overcome those prejudices, or
they're not even going to listen? They think that they were already apostate.
Yeah.
You know how some groups believe that the church became apostate within the first century? Well, Adventists are among those. They don't accept the early church, but
they'll quote the fathers, which is very interesting.
They do. But it's it really and truly is very easy. All you'd have to do, don't argue the Sabbath, just say, oh, we worship every day of the week. That's all you have to say to an Adventist. That's going to blow their mind.
I think we've said that before. That's one of the things I'll tell even my family members is, you do realize we've gone to Mass on Saturday since Christ.
That's right.
And they just don't have an answer for that. It's like Teresa was saying, it's the fact that you worship on Sunday. That's really the killer. Because it's almost like they don't, as long as you're on the books, Seventh-day Adventist books, they're not going to check to see if you go to church on Saturday. It's just, you better not be going to church on Sunday.
Right. Oh, I was just going to share this gem that you gave maybe a show or two back about the statistics that more Catholics go to Vigil Mass on Saturday than Seventh-day Adventists.
That's right.
That was a great point.
There are more Seventh-day Adventists, there are more Catholics sitting in the pews on Saturday than Seventh-day Adventists. That's another statistic that will just blow their mind. So
yeah, I love that point. I just needed to throw that in before we run out of time. So speaking of running out of time, we have maybe 2.5 minutes or so. So maybe you can give us a sneak peek what's going to be next on your series and anything else that you've been involved in.
Wow.
I'm tired. He works. So I've had to do all the research. Almost all of it.
Right.
But it's been exhausting. So we're trying to figure out, kind of like fall back, rethink about how to do this next. But honestly, I would just love to, because it's going to be a lot of different research if we do the Catholic the Catholic view or the Catholic history of the Sabbath, the theological development. So that would be a huge new project, but I would just love to do that if I could. That would be fun.
Yeah, that's what we're working on now, our ideas to go forth after this is through. This takes so much intensity that we're just trying to stay focused on it till it's finished and then go from there.
Yeah.
So you said you have one more video, then you're going to start promoting it?
Well, we want to conclude it. We want to have, just never Deo Volente. You don't want to start promoting something you can't finish. So once we get the concluding, which we're going to sum up everything, then we're going to start really promoting it. The series, the entire series on our YouTube video. But you can definitely go and see it now.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And boy, such great work. I can't wait for the series to end. So start promoting it and getting some Adventists to watch it. I think it'll be mind blowing if they're able to watch it. And go ahead.
It would have been for me as a Seventh-day Adventist to be able to see it. That was the impetus for us, is let's get something out there that has never been seen. I mean, we wanted some to be there, to be helpful.
Yeah, please pray for us.
Yeah.
In this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you, Gary. It's always a joy and a privilege. Thank you, sir.
And keep up the good work too. A great channel.
Thank you.
Yeah. The hour's gone. Believe it or not. The YouTube channel, folks. Arthur and Teresa Beam, BEEM.